The discussion that we're having is very much an ongoing discussion, and the culture panel and the address by James Shipton leads very nicely into our directors panel. We have a directors panel every year where we look at all the issues that are keeping directors awake at night. I'm probably tip that culture is fairly high on that agenda at the moment. So rather than rabbiting on, we will get straight to the panel. And if I can welcome our speakers and ask them to take the stage as I introduce them. Graham Hunt. Graham is the chairman of AGL Energy. He also chairs the National Resources Science Precinct and the Western Australian Energy Research Alliance. He's previously been a director of Broad Spectrum. Sally Pitkin is an independent non-executive chair of Super Retail Group and a non-executive director of Star Entertainment and a non-executive director of Link Administration Holdings. She's also a non-executive director of the AICD, chair of Opera Australia and a senator of the University of Queensland. And Sally is replacing Elizabeth Bryan this morning, who was unable to join us. Dr. Gary Weiss. Gary is the chairman of Ardent Leisure. He's also currently the executive director of Ariadne Australia, chairman of Ridley Corporation and Estia Health, and a non-executive director of Premier Investments, Thorney Opportunities and the Straits Trading Company. And Nicola Wakefield Evans. Nicola is a non-executive director of Lendlease, Macquarie Group, Macquarie Bank and Bupa. Nicola is also an independent non-executive director of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the AICD, and a member of the board of AsiaLink and AsiaLink Business, the University of New South Wales Foundation, and Chief Executive Women and the Takeovers panel. We have very, very busy directors. We're lucky to have them with us today. Please welcome them. We've talked a lot about culture already this morning. We've talked about, we've had James Shipton's address and also, of course, the Royal Commission, the APRA report into the Commonwealth Bank. And I just thought it would be good to start with your own perspectives on recent events, perhaps looking at the companies that you are all involved in. What gives you comfort that you're not in the same position as some of those companies that are in the headlines at the moment? Nicola?
Look, I actually don't think you can take comfort. And that's a conversation, the threads of which were picked up in earlier sessions. And that is that directors today are facing a few issues. One is the evolution of the role of a directorship, of a non-executive director, which was touched upon in the earlier session, which I'm sure we'll get to. The second one is directors needing to be chronically uneasy at all times. And I think that's one of the changes that I've observed over the role of directors individually and collectively as part of a board. And so you can be going along with your company thinking everything's fine and then be hit by something out of the ordinary. So I actually think that the recent events need to be a wake-up call to every director on any board, particularly big ones in any industry, because a loss of reputation or a big issue that emerges in the company, and we've seen, you can be unprepared for.
Graham, you run a very you chair a very customer-centric business. Are there any takeaways for you out of the Royal Commission and recent events, and has it changed or affected the conversations you have around the board table?
Well, I agree with Nicola in the sense that I think any board or any director that's feeling comfortable is probably in the wrong spot to start with. And the events of the last few months have just made that much clearer, I guess, than perhaps it was on some people's radar before. I think that, if there is a similarity between a company like AGL Energy and a bank is we have a lot of retail customers. And so we have a lot of relationships with people that we bill almost 4 million around the country. So ensuring that relationship, that you don't get it wrong in that process. But I think one of the risks out of what's happened in the last little while in the Royal Commission is ensuring that there is a proper differentiation between an honest mistake, where as a result of the number of transactions you have to take or implementation of change, you get something wrong, as opposed to decisions or actions or directions within the company where there isn't a concern about what happens or the impact on the customer or the person that you're holding their funds. So I think there is quite a difference. Like most things, though, there's probably some shades of grey in the middle, and the big risk would be that if whatever additional regulation comes out of all of that, it actually pushes the compliance requirements in a direction that makes it very difficult to actually make good change in an organisation, because if we just try to avoid making, or try to get to a point where we make zero mistakes, to me that says paralysis, which is not in anyone's best interest at the end.
When you look at what's happening, and I know that you don't want to comment on specifics, no one does, but if you looked at these companies and the boxes that they ticked and the compliance that they followed, in theory that would all be good, wouldn't it? So in some ways it's really not down to compliance, is it? Or not down to extra regulation?
Well, again, that's a risk, and in many organisations, and even in the resource sector where I spent a lot of my earlier career, the bigger risks for organisations are often the things that what I call are creeping risks. So when you do a risk assessment in mining, you're always concerned that the roof's going to fall in, or those kind of things, and so you do all the work necessary to get expert opinion, etc., to make sure that that kind of catastrophic risk can't happen. And even then, sometimes the wrong thing happens at the end of the day. But issues around behaviour that lead to the kind of reports that we've seen recently about cultures of big organisations, sometimes you can be too close to those things to actually see that there is an evolution happening over, in some cases, many decades, where, as Simon said earlier, the signals that are being sent about what is acceptable or not acceptable are not being properly reinforced over that period of time. And so people will do what they think is right, even if it might be at odds with what the charter of the company says. And I'm saying that says, what interests my boss fascinates me. And that happens. So if the leadership of the organisation is sending messages either explicitly or implicitly about what's important, that's what people are going to do.
Sally, what about you, and particularly with Super Retail?
So we've got a board meeting next Tuesday, and you won't be surprised to know that that's the first thing on our board agenda for our meeting. For me, what's come out of the Royal Commission and other more recent reports from regulators is I want for us as an organisation to go back to those foundational elements of culture and ethics. And culture, you want it to be effective to achieve your purpose. And you want to have high standard of ethics. Both of those things are quite complex and quite difficult to change if you need to change them and to manage on an ongoing basis. Culture's difficult to change because culture's all about how people in an organisation have been doing things sometimes for a very long period of time. And the reason they do it that way is because that's what's been effective in the past, to get things done internally or to respond to external threats. And ethics, the research shows us that people have a lower moral compass in a work environment than they do personally. And that's a very complex interplay between how they are at work and how they respond to those signals they receive at work about what's acceptable or not. So they're the foundational things that I'll be talking to our board about with our senior leadership team, and continue to talk to them about. Those two things have got to infuse everything we do. At Super Retail Group, I feel confident around our purpose because we're all about helping people enjoy their leisure time. Now, I know that sounds very simple, but we really do try to have that influence everything we do. But of course, we've got to have high ethical standards. We've got to do the right thing by customers.
And we'll come back to that question once you've talked about your culture and the ethics, how you then change them if you find they're wanting. And if I can ask you, Gary, you come at this from a slightly different direction. You've usually pretty much always got significant skin in the game. What do you make of recent events?
Sorry, what do I make?
What do you make of recent events? I'm being deliberately vague there.
Two broad observations. Charlie Munger put it very well when he said, show me the incentive and I'll show you the behaviour. So when you look at some of the behaviour that's been demonstrated publicly in recent times, and indeed in not so recent times, the behaviour complained of often goes right back to the root cause of the incentive structure in place, people responding to that regime. The other factor too is that it all starts at the top. It needs a board, it needs a strong leadership team to embrace not just the concept of compliance, but also the spirit of compliance. You need to actually embrace compliance as being a worthy and very deserving goal in its own right. It actually is a very good business reason for having exceptional compliance. It's just good business. And so that's the culture we try and impute. If I could perhaps cite a passage from Warren Buffett who puts it in far better terms than I can. So as people may recall, Salomon Brothers back after the 87 crash got into significant regulatory difficulties with the US government, and Buffett became chairman. And in an address to congressional hearing, he said this, and I think there's a lot in this. But in the end, the spirit about compliance is as important or more so than words about compliance. I want the right words and I want the full range of internal controls. But I have also asked every Salomon employee to be his or her own compliance officer. After they first obey all rules, I then want employees to ask themselves whether they are willing to have any contemplated act appear the next day on the front page of their local paper to be read by their spouses, children and friends, with the reporting done by an informed and critical reporter. I think that's not a bad yardstick to measure the spirit of compliance and culture with.
So Nicola, if you have the right ethics in theory as a board and you have the right culture, how do you know if something's going wrong before it all blows up? Like what are the red flags? Because I reckon if I'd gone to Commonwealth Bank and asked them 2 years ago, how do you reckon you're going on this? Most of the directors would have said, we're okay.
It's a combination of things. So boards need to understand the business of the company that they sit on, and they have to get out of the boardroom to do that. And that's a combination of making sure that you're getting across the whole business. And for some businesses, like the companies that I sit on, they're big, complex, global companies, and our board spends a lot of time travelling. And we also have a very open relationship with the CEOs and management who actually allow us to dive into the companies as much as we like. And I think that's been a really important process. So it helps you understand the company, but it also allows you to meet people so that you can talk to them. And often red flags arise when you're on the shop floor, or you're in a warehouse, or you're on a construction site, or you're in a trading room, because you're observing people's behaviour. You can actually pick up cues quite easily that way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to ask the right questions and to make sure that the board is getting the right reporting. And I think if anything that's come out of the APRA review of the CBA, it's that the board wasn't getting the reporting they should have been getting on misconduct, on breaches of codes of conduct, and on breaches of the law. And the board has to ask and insist that they are getting that reporting. But then to get that reporting, you've got to turn it on its head as well and make sure that employees, as my other colleagues here have said, actually understand that they have to behave ethically, that you have to obey the law, that you need to obey the codes of conduct in a company, and that then you've got the right tone from the top, senior management team enforcing that. But on the other hand, you're getting the reporting if something goes wrong.
That reporting is a really interesting question, because and I haven't got the quote in front of me, but one of the things out of the APRA report into CBA was it talked about an intimidatory culture, that you had this incredibly intelligent executives who the implication was that they weren't necessarily making it easy for people to ask, for board directors to ask questions. So Graham, how do you manage that around a board? How much information is too much? Do you ever have to rein in a non-executive director? And how do you make them not feel intimidated by the collective awesomeness of, people like Vasey and co?
Well, I think there's multiple ways to do that. One of them, obviously, is to use the committee structure of boards to do more heavy lifting and get more visibility. I think that's a way to actually get closer to what's going on in the organisation. As an example of that, at AGL for a long time, our Health, Safety, Environment, Corporate Sustainability Committee pretty much always meets in an operating site. And when we do that, we get out and we have conversations with the staff. And in fact, we have sessions with shop floor staff in the absence of senior management. So we allow them to come in and talk to us about what's on their mind. And that gives you an opportunity to see whether the talk is actually being walked at the operating sites. Equally, organisations have to have very good whistleblower processes as well that enable people to be able to raise issues that they might have some concern about taking up through the line. And then it is about, I think also, not locking into a single set of performance metrics or reporting, either for a board subcommittee or the main board, that stays like that forever. It is about understanding what the touch points might be around a certain point in time, and making sure you're getting visibility of those things. I mean, a very powerful measure is actually getting visibility of turnover in an organisation and exit interview outcomes and being accessible. So I mean, one of the challenges I think for boards is this challenge of dichotomy almost between the definition of what independent is and what the need is to understand what's going on in the organisation. And I think in privately held companies it's a bit easier because there isn't as much tension. But we're held accountable for needing to know what's going on in the organisation, but you're not in a situation where you can, short of a key role for boards obviously is the appointment of the CEO, and a lot flows from that in terms of the culture within the organisation and how that trickles down, and the board's got to be fully involved obviously in that process and making sure that the cultural direction that you want to have in an organisation is actually occurring on the ground.
Sally, you actually spent a year inside a board that you're not appointed to as part of doing a PhD into culture. What did you learn from that? That's a really unique experience to have.
It was really hard being at all those board meetings and keeping my mouth closed, I have to say. Culture is quite hard to put your finger on, but to describe it, actually try to put it down on paper, is a very powerful first step to then being able to understand it, change it if you need it, and to monitor it. So that was one of the learnings. Another learning was each organisation, it needs to respond to its context. So we've got to be very careful when we take, as you called it, a box-ticking approach to anything in governance. Yes, there are your foundational pieces, but you've really got to think about how those things apply to your organisation. So the specificity of governance is something I think we've got to do better at.
Gary, I was asking how do you know when something's wrong before it blows up? Well, I guess sometimes you know because that's why you're there.
Yeah, well, usually we pick it up after it's blown up. But look, I think one has to accept that it's absolutely impossible for any board to be confident that at any point in time something untoward is not going on in any company. It's just an impossibility. So clearly you need to have systems in place to adequately monitor conduct and behaviour, but equally you need very effective processes to deal with misconduct and deal with it quickly, and on the basis of ensuring that the company's reputation and the reputation of each of the employees and other people associated with the company are protected by swift and appropriate action.
What about the role of the non-executive director? Do you have to be, or do you have to have run a company to be an effective non-executive director? How much professional experience do you need to have?
Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but clearly those who've had prior experience and know the trials and challenges of actually having executive responsibility, running an organisation, having appropriate reporting structures, both in terms of the overall team at the company and then reporting and working with the board. I think that is a very strong attribute, but not necessarily essential. There are plenty of very competent directors who have never run a commercial organisation, but who do bring a different perspective or experience to a board table.
Nicola, how rigorous is the process? And I guess if you're not going to say that there are certain qualifications that you have to have, how do you measure the ability of a non-executive director to be the right one for that business at that point in time?
It's an interesting process, and I actually think over the last 10 years, the process of selecting new directors to come onto a board has actually evolved. It's taking longer. You interview, so the days of being tapped on your shoulder and being asked, would you like to join my board, with no interviews or very few interviews, and sort of just like a tick the box or a very fast process have gone. Boards are looking out, I think as long as 5 years to make sure that they've got the right mix of expertise and experience and diversity, and not just gender. I mean, we've heard today that diversity comes in many forms, and that is an absolute must. Boards have to be diverse. You've got to have people who have had different experiences. I don't subscribe to the view that every non-executive director has to have had CEO experience, because you actually need people who've had different experiences, whether they've lived overseas, they've worked in the industry, or they've had different line or management experience. All of those pieces sort of come together. And you have to also have people who are willing to challenge. As a very well-respected chairman said to me, you've also got to have people who are brave, who are willing to take on management if necessary, who are willing to actually take on other directors if necessary. And then the question becomes, how do you judge all of that during a recruitment process? And it's a combination of having everybody, I think, on the board, and various senior management, including the CEO, interview prospective directors, and also talking to people they've worked with. So I think that's also been a big change, doing a much more extensive reference check and talking to people that they've worked with who they haven't given as referees, so doing a much wider review of that person's background, experience, talking to investors if you can. The problem with board processes is they are inclined to be shrouded in secrecy. So the first time you know of a new director is when the ASX announcement is lodged. But I think that process is evolving, and certainly in processes I've been involved in, you no longer rely on just somebody on the board saying, I've got this mate, he'll be he or she will be fabulous for this board. I think those days are going.
What about
I think that also it's much more rigorous renewal process too now. So directors are not staying on boards for 15, 20 years. So renewal is happening, and that's also then feeding into building those complementary skills around the table.
I don't know whether there might be a problem with Sally's mic. It's just a little bit of feedback. I wanted to ask about flipping it around and not so much looking at bringing in non-executive directors, but how do you judge boards before you take a position? You obviously do your own due diligence. Graham, how do you judge whether a board is good or not from the outside?
Well, for the same reason that Nicola spoke of, it's a little difficult sometimes because you can't just pick the phone up and ask the fund manager, what do you think of that board, because it's pretty clear why you asked the question. So you've obviously got to meet all of the people that are involved. You've got to ask pretty tough questions about the nature of the behaviour in the boardroom, how all that works, because as we heard earlier this morning, collaboration is important, but groupthink is dangerous. So, how do you make sure that works? And you just got to observe, I think, take some history lessons and observe how that organisation has performed over time. Try to understand what their strategy is based on what they say publicly and how they perform, and then kind of work out whether you fit or not, because what they need what a company needs going forward is not necessarily what it's had up until now. And so one of the big risks is that companies think they need to kind of replace like with like around the boardroom, and so when someone rolls off, they want to get someone with similar skill base. Equally, sometimes they're pushed towards doing things where there isn't the capability out there. For example, we're in a world where digital disruption has a big impact on all of our businesses, but how many directors are there even on a world basis that have got that kind of experience? And do you go to a 28-year-old geek and ask them to be on a public company board? And the answer's probably going to be, what? So how do you get advice from outside an organisation and inform all of directors as opposed to trying to find a specialist? And I think one of the things that I think that will arise out of the finance sector issue at the moment is, what is the right capability for a board going forward? Do they have to have had deep experience in that sector, or do they need to bring the right kind of inquiring mind to make sure that the organisation heads in the right direction?
Sally, how do you judge a board?
Certainly the things that you've just outlined. I also like to get a sense of the organisation from competitors or people that they collaborate with. When I think back to the HIH Royal Commission, it seemed that no one on that board really understood what was happening, but everyone in the industry knew that HIH was running an unsustainable business model and was going to collapse sometime soon. So I think what others are saying about that organisation is very important. Who the chair is critical, because that's the person that's going to lead the team and help everyone collectively to make the best decisions that you can.
Gary, how should investors judge a board? And, I'm talking, this is without any proverbial hitting the fan. In the normal course of events, how do you judge how effective a board is?
At the end of the day, performance. So companies performing well, investors happy, probably little criticism of a board. In contrast, an underperforming company that's lost its way, the view of the investment community will be pretty cynical about the ability of the board.
What do you reckon the biggest mistake is that a board makes?
Well, many of them, I suppose, but sometimes, I don't think there's one rule that responds to that particular question. There are times, for example, you can see a company that's sometimes been hijacked by a charismatic chief executive who often will select his board or her board and lead the company down a particular course. You can equally have a board that's absolutely out of touch with its management team and with the business. So there's not one answer that responds fully to your question.
Nicola, can I just make a comment there? I also think that boards get into a habit of not looking at their own processes and not innovating themselves. So, we're in a time when industries are being disrupted by either technology or incoming, new forms of competition. And we're requiring our companies, our management team and our companies to be innovative, to be flexible, to be agile, to be fast, to use technology. Yet when you look at board processes, and again, there's a sense of this in the APRA report of CBA, we run ourselves on processes that have been in place for over 100 years. Boards operate in a very confined space, and I've been very vocal and passionate in all the boards that I'm on, but also as part of the AICD, in challenging non-executive directors and boards to actually reevaluate and think about what they themselves are doing. Is the way that we operate the right way for the companies of today? Is it the right way to respond to a number of the issues that we've been talking about today? And how do we innovate? I mean, the only major innovation that's occurred is that board papers have been picked up and scanned and put into iPads, but in fact we haven't looked at whether the way that we use iPads is that we're using that technology effectively as an effective board.
But even down to, you know, the generally accepted monthly board meeting.
Yeah, that too. That too, and having everyone face to face. I'm on one board where we are trialling being more agile and having more board meetings if we need to, but allowing directors to dial in through their computer. So that we're not flying people around and putting them all in one spot for, you know, 4 or 5 hours in an out-of-session board meeting, but actually moving away from a telephone conference and having everyone on the screen. And that's actually very effective. And I think that's going to drive maybe a different way of boards actually meeting and getting together.
And Ali, if I could just add, as a complement to that, is then having rigorous board effectiveness reviews. You know, they're not necessarily easy processes to go through, and for some board members it may have been quite a long time since their executive days when they were subject to performance reviews. And so being open to that and open to the feedback that comes through can be quite challenging. I've got to face one on Tuesday where our board effectiveness review report's going to be delivered, and I said to the person who was facilitating it, there's a section on there on me as chair. I said, it's got to be in there. She said, don't you want to know what it says? I said, no, it's just important that everyone gets to see it. But that's not easy.
Let's go, before I open this up to questions, to that really core issue, which is everyone in the room pretty much accepts that there's a loss of trust and that there's a huge credibility problem with business, not just in financial services. The question is how you come back. So we've talked a lot about what makes good culture and what makes a more effective board, but how do you rebuild if it's gone wrong, and how do you rebuild enough to get back that trust? And particularly, Graham, if I bring you in here, that the fact that community expectations seem now to be in an entirely different place to where boards actually are.
Look, I think one of the problems is that it's very easy to solve for one variable, and it's also easy to solve for one variable depending on what time frame you're talking about. So we heard this morning most of the organisations in this room take a long-term view about value and are patient investors. You know, while we've been sitting in this room, the value of everyone's portfolio has moved around, in some cases probably hugely, not because of people that are taking a long-term view, but because people are taking a short-term view. So organisations are also driven by the views of those people whose focus might be much shorter than those that are taking a long-term view. And I think that's one of the issues around that as a variable. There's also this piece that around, I think you mentioned earlier, soft and hard targets. There was significant criticism of companies that had soft targets. You know, please only have hard measurable targets. And guess what? Those hard measurable targets are profits, returns, etc., that are all linked to incentives. And the soft targets around changing culture, building diversity, etc., were in many cases dismissed as not being good targets because it was too easy for executives to get bonuses. Now, if you take all those away, then are you actually sending the wrong signals about where you want organisations to go? So I think all of that's got to be thought of.
To be fair though, you did get whacked over the head until you agreed not to pay a fixed increase to your CEO.
That's right. That's right. And we learnt a lot from the need for more transparency, as well as more explanation about the link between strategy and targets. And I think a lot of organisations don't actually sell enough why we are measuring these things and why that is important for shareholders to drive an organisation in a certain direction, particularly when it's around those so-called soft targets. But I think, also the whole thing about Rem we could spend all day on, particularly in sectors where access to global talent is very important, and expectations around how you manage all of that. But the thing about how do you rebuild trust? By doing the right things, not trying to get everything right. Drucker once said the difference between leadership and management was you'd be a great manager by never getting anything wrong, but you might not be doing the right things and leading the organisation in the direction you need to go. So we need to make sure we don't lose that difference in terms of where we go from here, because if we do, I think the danger is we'll be perfectly correct, but so stagnant that we won't be making any money for anybody.
Gary, as you said, you often come in when things have already blown up, so you are in the position of, well, not starting with a clean slate, but certainly starting with a need to fix. What do you do in a really practical sense? How do you attack it?
Well, usually the problem and trouble company starts at the top. So almost inevitably, we will insist on change it, both in terms of board composition and usually senior leadership. And I can say almost without exception for the particularly troubled companies, having removed those issues, you find yourself with a team that's been lacking guidance, leadership, inspiration, but good people who want to be on the winning team. They know what's gone wrong, they know how to fix it, and you just empower them to get on with it. And one of the most classic examples of this was when we took effective control of Woolworths back in the late 80s. All that we did was to change the board, remove the chief executive and bring back Paul Simons. Thereafter, up until relatively recently, every chief executive that followed Paul had been at Woolworths at the time we took control. So it was just dealing with the culture at the top, the leadership or lack of it at the top, and providing as I said, the leadership that most people in a company want to see. Most people, I find, want to be on a winning team.
Nicola?
So I would agree with all of that and add that you need to have clear lines of accountability, and that's from everybody. Everybody has to understand what they're accountable for. You've got to have clear statements around behaviour, what's acceptable and unacceptable. And if I can draw a contrast between those companies that deal with safety, so transport companies, mining companies, construction companies, industrial companies, if you look at the language they use publicly and internally around safety, it's completely unambiguous. We have zero tolerance for unsafe work practices. We have zero tolerance for people who don't abide by our safety culture. Very, very clear. If you look across into the financial services industry and you look at statements that we make around misconduct, that language is completely different. It's woolly, it's not as clear. We've got to get to a stage where from the board and the senior management down, we're making very clear statements about what behaviour is acceptable.
But how easy is that? Because you can all say, act ethically, here are the 3 top values of our company, do the right thing. It's so much more, safety is so much easier. It's like, use the machine wrongly and you'll die.
Well,
but it's so much...
I disagree. I actually disagree. I think you can learn from the safety message, and we have to get to a point where people behave ethically and actually understand what that means, and have the systems, the training, and also I think asking. I always ask employees, what does the company stand for, and how do you describe your role in what you do compared to either the standards we live by or the purpose of the company. Tell me in your own words what that means to you. And you can get some very surprising answers, both positively and negatively. And of course, when you get things that you're a bit uneasy about, that gives you the opportunity to raise it with management and to get that sort of issue looked at. But I think we've just got to be much more clear. The language has to be much clearer, and we have to be very transparent as companies, both externally and so with all of our stakeholders externally and with our employees internally. We've just got to change that language.
Sally?
I would agree with that, and I think that in rebuilding this trust, stakeholders will play a very important role. Internal stakeholders and external stakeholders and organisations have to be talking with those people in an open way about what they're doing, progress, what they're hoping to achieve, and that communication has to be continual.
To go back to the safety thing, DuPont, one of the world's biggest producers of explosives initially, and now kind of a world expert in industrial safety, would say that you get the standard that you walk past.
That's right.
So in other words, if you see something, both from a positive and negative perspective, if you need to positively reinforce the right behaviour, and if it's not up to scratch, you need to do something there and then. And there's got to be, as Nicola said, there's a language in mining companies around things like cardinal rules. You break a cardinal rule, you're out. It doesn't matter whether you're the mine manager or the executive general manager, there is a rule and there is no correspondence will be entered into. It's interesting that when DuPont started, the way they got the message across, but they would say it's quite different now, is they forced their explosive plant managers to live on the factory site with their families. So there was, the consequence of getting something wrong was very close to home. So, but if you ask them today, they would say, well, that would offend their current view of values, and that they learnt that kind of hard and fast, almost regulation, didn't necessarily drive the right behaviour. So I think there is that issue about how do you get the right behaviour in organisations? Do you do it through trying to incite fear of what the regulatory outcomes might be if you do the wrong thing? Or do you try to do it through pride? And as Gary said before, in some organisations you take the bottleneck away, which is whatever's stopping the right culture, and suddenly great things happen. I mean, in my previous executive role, we did a lot of first generation outsourcing. So we took over businesses that would typically have been run by government or instruments of government for a long time. And within a 3-year contract, we could change the culture quite quickly by being able to espouse the right values and get the right measures and put good leadership in. And people want to do good things given the opportunity, but sometimes they do wrong things if they think they're doing the right thing.
But surely it has to be a mixture of fear and pride, because pride alone, you need to know there will be consequences.
But the thing about that is, I mean, there's again, human behaviour. What drives human behaviour is near-term, high probability outcomes, not longer-term, uncertain outcomes. So people smoke because it's going to take some time to get cancer and die, and they might not get it. Whereas if they stick their finger in a circular saw, they know what's going to happen immediately. So what is the right change? I mean, if you had the death penalty for jaywalking, would people at 3 a.m. in the morning when there's no cars and no one looking still jaywalk? I suspect they would. So it's about what the brain tells you about the risk and how that drives behaviour. And maybe we need to think about that in terms of where we go.
We haven't touched on a whole range of other issues, which I can get to if you haven't got any questions, but I'm guessing that you have. So if we've just got a couple of roving mics, we've got one down here, and then we'll go over there.
My question's to Graham, and you made some, some commentary around how you try and get all the systems in place and the right people, and sometimes bad things happen. Isn't that exactly the problem? Because bad things don't happen, Graham. People do bad things. And when there's a disconnect between cause and effect, that's where we get these type of aberrations. So I'd like to hear your response to that.
Yeah. I think there is a difference, and I agree with you entirely. If people do a bad thing and they know it's wrong, there is no excuse and there has to be consequences of that. I think what sometimes happens is that they start off doing what they believe is right, and sometimes what happens with, for example, introduction of a new billing system or reporting system or whatever, you are producing so many million documents every month, and sometimes they go wrong. Now, sure, the checks and balances could have been there and should have been there to make sure those mistakes don't happen. Is that, in my mind, is that the same as a considered deliberate strategy or tactic within an organisation to do the wrong thing? And I was just trying to get the differentiation between those. Because if you're trying to solve for zero negative outcomes in an organisation, it's very costly and it's probably impossible because humans will always make some mistakes. What you need to do is to make sure that you focus in on the things that are going to cause the most impact, and particularly get rid of a culture where people don't care about the consequence of what they do and lose the view about what the purpose of the organisation is. But I guess to pick up that point, what is the purpose of a public company? Is it to make money for its shareholders? Is it to serve its customers? And in some cases they're the same. Or is it there for the greater social good? Now the answer is some combination of those three things, because if you lose your licence to operate, then you're not going to serve your customers or make money for your shareholders. So that's my point about how do you solve for those multiple variables, and over what time period do you do that is a big challenge for organisations. And that's the challenge, and I think what we've seen in the last few months is a focus on what getting it wrong can cause, but where do we go from here and make sure that we don't just solve for one of those things in too much emphasis at the expense of the others.
And Gary, can I just ask you, because there is, obviously people talk about the risk that we become too risk averse, or we now get so busy worrying about our culture and our compliance, but you talk about that line between making sure that staff understand that on the one hand, if you make a mistake, it's okay if it's genuine, but the moment you bring a company into disrepute, it's a zero tolerance.
Correct.
Yeah.
And on that issue, you have to be ruthless. If people are genuinely trying to do their job honestly, etc., but mistakes happen, they happen in every walk of life, you deal with that, training or whatever. But the moment there is conduct which reflects adversely on the company and its employees and other stakeholders, then you need to act quickly and deal with the issue appropriately.
And that captures all unethical behaviour.
Yeah.
Any unethical behaviour, the person has to leave.
Unless it's an entire group, which seems to be one of the problems that we've had in recent times. We have a question down the back. Oh, there, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Nina Hazler and I'm from Care ESG Research. So what I see at the moment is women in the firing line, whether we take Deborah Thomas, the CEO of Ardent Leisure, when she stepped down after the Dreamworld disaster, whether we take the recent example of what was spoken about the AMP board members resigning, but also when we even look at the Royal Banking Commission and see that most of the representatives that those banks and financial services are pushing out forward to talk to Justice Hayne, they're women. And if you look at the percentage of women who are actually in senior management, they're a very small proportion of that. So my question to the board is, why do you think it's women in the firing line? Do you think it's a different style of leadership that women take where they're more prone to taking responsibility? Or do you think it's the problems, the structural and cultural problems in company cultures, within boards, within executives, within the company? So particularly a question for the female board members. But
Nicola, do you want to start that one?
I think it actually needs to be a question to everybody,
Yes,
not
yes.
just the female
It will
board
be.
members.
We'll get there.
It's a really, really good question, and I think the answers are very complex. So on the one hand, we've had a very significant push, for a long time for women to be able to reach positions of power and influence right across our world, from politics to corporations, even you know, heads of schools. We don't have women actually achieving those positions of senior management and power. Along with that, I think there are systemic cultural issues in this country, and we are seeing a bit of a backlash, and we've seen that through the reporting of how women have sort of seemingly failed in their duty, which I think is manifestly unfair. However, if you look at AMP, it wouldn't have mattered had there been a male chair, the outcome would have been the same. In the circumstances of what's happened arising out of the Royal Commission, the circumstances that you were left, the chair had to take the course of action that Catherine ultimately took, and the decision she made was the right, you know, I think most people would agree was the right decision. What was egregious was how her gender played into the reporting of her ability to actually do her role, which is not something that we can actually comment on.
What about the fact that it was only 2 female directors? Yes, they were up for re-election, but they were the ones who said they're not going to stand for re-election. No one else did.
I think that's really serious, but that goes back, you know, the combination of which directors stand for election each year is actually set months in advance of an AGM. So the combination of the 3 directors who stood for election at AMP would have been decided 6 months ago in the normal course of working out who sits where on the boards. And I'd make the observation, which is public, that the two female directors' terms had actually not even expired. So the board makes that decision. It's not the decision of the chair. It's a collective decision about if you've reached the end of your term, then you have to stand. But you also need to have at least in that case 3 directors stand. So it was an unfortunate combination with the decision made a long time ago. Why did they step down? I don't think we know. We don't really know the answer to that question. And I think, as the previous panel, some of the commentators said, it's interesting to note that none of the male directors on that board have felt the need to stand down.
Gary, what do you make of I mean, there is no question the recent events are being seen to a certain extent through a gender lens.
Well, perhaps just referring to the Ardent situation, which was something that occurred well before I arrived. I think Deborah had a very distinguished career in publishing, working alongside Kerry Packer for 20 years, which he was not an easy taskmaster, as we all know. But I think it was the circumstances of Deborah's appointment which rather coloured the market's view of Deborah. She was a non-executive director and then appointed as chief executive, replacing a predecessor who had been in the role for a significant period of time and had delivered some pretty good results for ardent security holders. So I think the circumstances of Deborah's appointment coloured the market's view, and then the decline in performance over a period of time, and then of course on top of that decline in performance came the absolute tragedy at Dreamworld, all impacted on the market's view of the leadership at Ardent.
So she would have gone if she was a fellow? It wouldn't have made a difference?
I think that would have been the case. I think a chief executive who presides over a period of underperformance is always at risk, whether that person is male or female.
So looking more broadly and beyond that, I mean, how do you read the current debate about diversity from a more women point of view and the lens which was being put on recent troubles?
Yeah, look, I'm very conscious of the discussion and debate. I must say, for all the boards that I'm involved in, we look for candidates with the right credentials, and to be honest, great if they're women, great if they're men. It's a very the critical focus for us is on getting the right people to drive the right performance at a company. And performance isn't measured, as we've already covered, purely by financial performance. It's creating and delivering on a performance, financial performance, and integrity and quality in what you do as a business. I think that's absolutely critical.
So I do want to put you on the spot. Do you think, as part of the diversity campaign, some women have been elevated above their abilities? That's not to say exactly the same thing hasn't happened to men, but women.
There may be, as I'm sure that, and I can certainly testify to the fact that there are plenty of men that have been elevated way beyond their station, and indeed sometimes when we've invited ourselves onto boards and we sit around the table with people who out in the real world have commanded, you know, quite good, perceived to have very good commercial nous and reputation. Often we find that we wonder how those reputations have been achieved.
Sally?
I would endorse Nicola's comments very strongly. Could I add two things? I think that there is a systemic cultural issue in Australia about women holding positions of power or influence, or even participating in areas of work that have been predominantly the domain of men. I'll give you one quick example. When my daughter started studying physics at university several years ago, it was made very clear to her, as the only woman in that physics classroom, that she didn't belong and she should get out. The second observation I'd make is that it's very different being a non-executive director. You are the person who's ultimately accountable because you have ultimate authority in that organisation. And so you can lose your position at any time, and you need to be prepared to resign and leave the company because the buck does stop with you. And I do think some executives who aspire to perhaps roles as a non-executive director don't quite appreciate that distinction.
Is your daughter still studying physics?
She completed her physics degree.
Excellent.
As well as honours in philosophy. So, interesting conversations.
She can take anyone on, I imagine. Graham, what do you think?
Look, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think there is a risk of quotas can be dangerous. And I think whenever there is a difference between whatever is reflected in civil society and what happens within business, there's always going to be a tension that needs to be managed over a realistic time frame. But getting to a point that says, if through a natural process of someone rolling off a board, and if that person is male or female, if someone asks, the first question they ask is, should their replacement be male or female? That can be dangerous because you need to be thinking about skills over a period of time, and a 2, 3, 4, 5 year program of having the right skills around the table. I was accountable for some mining and smelting businesses in South Africa when they went through a process of quotas in management. And it was difficult because there were people that ended up in roles that were not quite ready for them. And that was bad for them as individuals. Ultimately good for the country to push people along, but as individuals they were put under stress that they weren't really ready for. Please don't take that's a commentary around this current situation because it's not. It's just a broader comment. I think I subscribe very much to if it happens on your watch, you're accountable. And if you're the chairman of an organisation and something goes wrong, you should be the first out the door. Now the question then is how much more of the board is involved in that process. And we're not privy to what went on in the boardroom to determine whether there was a discussion about whether the other board members should go up for re-election and therefore they should be the next ones to roll off or not. Who knows? I'd like to think that there was a conversation and would be a conversation in all boardrooms, and in the end the decision was reached with the good of the outcomes for shareholders at the top of the list. I just pick up on the second part of the question I think anyone's addressed is, why with the Royal Commission do we see so many female representatives for the banks? And I think probably because they present a more empathetic face than senior male executives.
But
And I'm sure that there's research to support that. And is that good or bad? I think there's a reason for it, because those organisations thought that they were putting forward a face which was in their best interest.
but then they met Rowena Orr and maybe thought they'd made the wrong decision.
Yeah, well,
She is formidable.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of interesting analysis that can go on down the track as to who was advising whom in that process.
You'd have to wonder then about those organisations' values in terms of care for employees, because why put people in that situation just because you think it's going to present a better face?
Well, I don't know whether that's why they did it or whether they thought they were the best for but it does say something about the overall culture as to how do you make decisions and what's the implication of those decisions, be it for your shareholders, your employees and other stakeholders. So,
But there is a precedent for this, and I go back to James Hardie, and I remember very well when James Hardie was in absolute crisis, who took over? Meredith Hellicar,
yeah.
and she became the face. I don't think it was an accident. Next question. Where do we have the next mic? Whoever's got that, sorry, I can't see. Whoever's got, right, thank you.
Thank you. Dom Figlamini, LG Super, and it's really a question in relation to the board accepting responsibility. We can go back to Telstra when there was a new CEO and brought over his amigos, etc. And the first comment that was made was, I would not give these shares to my mother. The share price of Telstra at the time tanked. The board actually did absolutely nothing to actually try and protect the Telstra shareholders. In fact, it allowed Telstra to just be decimated over a period of time, probably to the extent we see the result today. Equally, I take that a little bit further and I look at situations where you have a new CEO who comes into an organisation, all of a sudden the CEO says, this company is overvalued, does a complete revaluation, has an impact on the share price, which may tank or may not. The board, with all of the directors that have been there for X years or whatever the period, have not seen this. And all of a sudden, one CEO comes in and says, we have an overvalued company. I really question the capacity of the board to, in a lot of cases, say, we've got it wrong. I don't see too many of them come out unless they've actually been dragged through the regulatory or legislative process, and we just see that now. The actual board to take, I suppose, responsibility for some of these decisions, because it really is an issue where you just get one CEO and all of a sudden the whole assets of the company are revalued. I was just wondering if I can have a comment on that total corporate board responsibility in addressing some of these issues.
It's a really good question because it's absolutely standard practice. I mean, everyone expects a new CEO to come in and, first thing they do is announce a downgrade.
I don't think we should say it's standard practice. I know what we see are those examples where the CEO has done that, but what we're not seeing, what you don't see, are all the examples where the board says to the CEO, no, that's not appropriate, and no, we're not doing that. And those conversations are happening in corporate Australia.
And where it is happening, though, where you do get that, where does board accountability sit?
The board's accountable for that decision. The board is the one who has ultimate accountability and ultimate authority. So the board has to be backing the CEO on that decision, and they can't say, oh, well, that was just because the CEO wanted to do it.
No, but it's happened on their watch, is the point, I guess. That if a new CEO comes in and says, in fact, we're massively overvalued, well, that massive overvalue has happened on the watch of the board.
Yeah, I think you've got to look at it on a case-by-case basis, because I know, the last CEO job I had, I didn't do that. And it meant I got no bonuses for the first 2 years because I left the value of the company where it was and actually had to rebuild it to where it was. But the board had taken an action to fire my predecessor. So it had done something, and there was subsequent board turnover in the next few years. So again, it comes back to this issue. I mean, we have the model that we have, and I guess there's an open question about should we have the model that we have? And there's also a view about, well, what kind of board stability do you need to have? How much corporate knowledge is there? I mean, would corporations completely disappear overnight if the non-executive directors were there this week and replaced by 6 or 7 newbies next week? interesting question.
But what's the answer?
I don't know. I'm sure there are some examples of it where there's been change of control of organisations. That happens all the time. But typically they're replaced by organisations that spent a long time and a lot of money getting to know the organisations and have thought about who they want to have in those roles. And so there is a form of continuity, if you like, as opposed to step change in continuity. We don't have to have the model that we have, and some would say that's why a lot of money is not in the public company space anymore, because there are other models. Are they better or worse? They're not as visible, so how do you know?
So I think that the answer to the question is clearly the board needs to take accountability, and I agree with Sally. You actually, and that accountability manifests itself in very, very different ways. Directors leaving a board if they don't agree with a collective decision of the rest of the board, and you do see that quite a lot. So, and it goes back to Sally's point that you are responsible, you're accountable for your own performance as a non-executive director, and if you don't like the direction that the board is taking or the direction that management's taking, the one thing you can do is actually leave the board. And we've had some departures in corporate Australia that have sent very strong signals about board functionality or dysfunctionality. That's the first thing. The second thing is the firing of a CEO is actually the board's ultimate responsibility, and boards do that and take that responsibility very seriously. The question is then how do they deal with the incoming CEO? And you often get with an incoming CEO a refreshing of the board. That sort of happens organically and as part of that process.
Can I just ask you, from the point of view of investors, if a director does resign from a board because they disagree with the process, it's not often, and in fact I can think of two very high profile cases where it didn't happen, they don't say anything. So around the board everyone knows why they've gone, but everyone else is left to assume. If you resign from a board on a principle, should you make a public statement?
I think that's a really complicated question. It depends on the circumstances. It really depends on the circumstances of the company, what's gone on in the board table. We have had directors who have resigned and publicly stated why they've resigned, but that's not going to be appropriate in every circumstance. And you can have disagreements. You actually want boards.
This is the diversity of opinion that we talked about.
It's the diversity of opinion. You do want boards that have robust discussions and that there are disagreements, but in the end they come to a collective understanding. And you can often agree on a course of action that was not the course of action put up to the board in the first place. That happens a lot as well.
What time?
But Elliot, it is a very difficult situation for a director if there is this great push to be entirely collegiate, for boards to be as one on board decisions, and it takes, very rare case for a director to dissent and not go, and then questions of whether, if you do dissent, whether you register your dissent while still staying on the board. So I had an instance a number of years ago in New Zealand, albeit armed with a 20% shareholding. My colleagues around the board table, scratching around to try and improve the full year profit result, decided to change accounting policies to now seek to equity account an investment, a 16.9% holding in another company that had not been previously equity accounted up until that time. But they needed the profit, so they decided to change accounting policies. I said this was ridiculous. They managed to get the auditors to go along with it. And I said, well, I'm not only voting against it, but I will issue a public statement to say that I disassociate myself from the decision. Well, there was a lot of pressure to toe the line, which I ignored, and indeed published my own statement to the Stock Exchange, giving the reasons why I felt equity accounting an investment from that level was preposterous. So excited a fair measure of debate. But
How are things around that board table after that?
but I was able to do it because we own 20% of the company. We were one of the largest shareholders. So, but if you don't have skin in the game, sitting around the table, what do you do?
Gary had to bring his own lunch from that point on.
So,
You had to bring your own lunch to board meetings.
We've just got time for one more question, so just down here.
Hi, this is Daniela Jaramillo from HESTA. And I want to move the conversation a little bit beyond culture and diversity and thinking more of increasingly investors are trying to understand the real world impact of the companies they invest in. And this includes climate change and how our companies contributing to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Are boards evolving to respond to these investor concerns? And if so, how are they evolving to understand these challenges and respond to investors on those questions?
Just ask you to be very brief in your responses to that, Nicola.
So specifically on all of the boards that I sit on, we have a board committee that is responsible for ESG. I chair one of those. I think if you're a financial services company in Australia, you are required to understand climate change because APRA has identified it as a risk. So that work is going across the financial sector. Boards are increasingly taking responsibility and looking at things like making sure that they've got anti-slavery commitments right throughout the company, that they're dealing with their suppliers, particularly smaller suppliers, properly, that they understand the climate risks in relation to that company, the investments they make or the developments that they construct, and increasingly pushing the boundaries, particularly in property companies, for example, pushing the boundaries to make sure that we are building, sustainable buildings or sustainable precincts that will last a lot longer than we all will. So I think it is something certainly that I've observed the boards are taking very seriously.
Do things like climate change, Graham, they're just part of doing business?
Well, it's part of doing business, and I think there's no question that companies like AGL spend more time talking to investors and proxy advisors and all sorts of interest groups on those kind of issues than they actually do about financial performance, because that's what, in many cases, determines where the money that's represented by companies in this room goes and all around the world. So you just can't ignore it. And as a result of that, you'll find that, if you look at most annual reports, now you'll find that the number of pages dedicated to the REM report and the number of pages dedicated to ESG issues is a lot more than the accounts. Is that right or wrong or good or bad? It's just where we are today. And I think it's people are making decisions about where they invest their money based on a whole lot of other considerations over and above what the returns are.
And also from a risk perspective, for example, at Super Retail Group, 2 of our board members will go up to China in September to kick the tyres of the supply chain up there. That's important risk management we see as well.
And I know, Gary, in a previous life you've visited God knows how many countries, looking at how many factories to see what the conditions are like. But these are subjects that will be the topic of 2 panels this afternoon. I just want to finish with our panel and you raised it actually, Nicola, at the very beginning. The APRA report to CBA made the sort of distinction between chronic ease and chronic unease. Do we all agree that chronic unease is probably the best state of play for any board?
Absolutely.
Dear, who'd be a director these days? Please join me in thanking our directors very much for their time and their insights, Graham and Sally and Gary and Nicola.